welcome. So welcome to our thought leadership webinar for October, engaging effectively with the Indigenous workforce. My name is Nicole Huska, and I am the National Director for Member Relations here at Indigenous Works. The presentation will be done by Mandy Price. I will put my email address in the chat. If you have any questions outside of the scope of this webinar, feel free to send them to me. And feel free to use the chat function for any other questions that you might have. I'm also going to turn on the closed captioning, and there we go. So I'll hand it over to you, Mandy. We're going to do the presentation, and then it's open floor Q&A after that. So welcome, and we're happy you're here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mandy Price. I'm a Anishinaabe member of Red Rock Indian Band. I am a training and consultant associate with Indigenous Works. I belong to the Eagle Clan. I am a first-generation residential school and day school survivor of my MBA in business management, and I'm currently working on my PhD in business management and leadership. With that, I would like to honor my traditional territory. As mentioned, I am from the Red Rock Indian Band, who are signatories of the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. I'd like to acknowledge Canada as the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and I recognize this land that is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and land that continues to be unceded territory today. As mentioned, I am working on my PhD. So I am speaking to you this afternoon from the lands of the Choctaw Nation found here in Oklahoma. About Indigenous Works. Come under a recommendation in the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, commonly known as RCAP. Our mandate is to increase Indigenous engagement in the Canadian economy. We are an award-winning ISO certified national Indigenous organization with expertise in workplace employment, corporate Indigenous engagement, and partnership systems. In 2015, we launched the Kachita charity, whose mandate is to increase the human resources and career potential of Indigenous youth, including youth with disabilities. We also have our Luminary project, whose sole purpose is to advance Indigenous innovation. Today's thought leadership objectives. We're going to discuss the historical impacts on Indigenous peoples, call to action number 92 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as your framework, strategies to engage Indigenous business relationships, and understanding the business benefits to cultivating business relationships with Indigenous peoples. First, we must understand the Indigenous populations. Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in Canada, with a population that grew by 9.4% between 2016 and 2021. Indigenous peoples are also the youngest population in Canada. About 46% were under the age of 25 in 2021, compared to 28% of the non-Indigenous population. The term Métis is used to describe communities of mixed European and Indigenous descent across Western Canada, and is defined by the Métis Nation of Canada as a specific community of people which comprises distinct Métis communities developed along the routes of the fur trade and across the Northwest within the Métis Nation homelands. This homeland includes the three prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as parts of Ontario, British Columbia, and Northwest Territories, and the Northern United States. The Métis represent about 35% of the Indigenous population. The Inuit are the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic. The word Inuit means the people in the Inuit language of Inuktitut. Inuit people comprise 3.9% of the total Indigenous population, with 70,540 individuals identifying as Inuit on the 2021 census. Approximately 1 million registered Indians in Canada comprise 45% of the Indigenous population. There are 634 First Nation communities in Canada, which represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. According to the 2021 Census of Canada, about 40% of registered Indians live on reserve. 14% live in rural areas off reserve, and 45% live in urban areas. 70% of First Nations reserve communities have less than 500 inhabitants, while only 4% have more than 2,000 inhabitants. Non-status Indians live almost exclusively off reserve. Non-status Indians account for 14% of the Indigenous population, and about 76% live in urban areas. Projections to 2041. In 2041, the total Indigenous population would include about 1.5 million to 1.8 million First Nations people, about 9.9 million to 1.2 million Métis peoples, and 92,000 to 101,000 Inuit peoples. The 4 pillars of historical exclusion impacting the Indigenous population: social, political, economic, and education. And we're going to discuss them further. Social exclusion. Granted a travel document authorized by an Indian agent to leave the reserve, where decades of restricted movement negatively impacted culture, economies, societies, and families. This was a catalyst for distrust in the Canadian government and systems. This was a means for controlling the movement of First Nations people and preventing gatherings, ceremonies, and mobilized resistance. To the right of the slide, you'll see an actual example of what the past system looked like in 1941. Project Surname, Inuit dog tags. They were replaced by numbers in the 1929 federal government renaming strategy. Inuit names were replaced after complaints about the Inuit not bearing Christian names. The strategy lasted for decades, with one of the initiatives requiring Inuit people to wear metal ID dog tags that resembled dog tags. Political exclusion. The Indian Act. It was created in 1876 as a means to facilitate assimilation, setting regulations and restricting the rights of First Nations people and communities, authorizing the Canadian federal government to regulate and administer the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indians and reserve communities. It imposed structures like our band councils and reserve lands, and restricted or made illegal our traditional forms of government, such as hereditary chiefs, our ceremonies, such as Sundan and Potlatch, the gathering of 3 or more Indigenous people, and Indigenous people's ability to access the courts or lawyers. We were considered wards of the state. Indigenous Canadians were not considered citizens. Canadian government made decisions on our behalf without consulting us. While the Indian Act has been revised over the years, it still continues to exist and govern us to this day. Economic exclusion. Farming and grain exchange and oil and gas reserves were controlled by the Canadian government. The government also prohibited the Métis to participate in the numbered treaty-making processes throughout Western Canada. Instead, Métis people were required to individually claim their land title through a system the government called Métis scrip. The system was intentionally confusing, slow, and legally complex, thereby disenfranchising the Métis of their land rights in order to support white settlements throughout the prairies. The majority of Métis were defrauded of scrip by banking and government institutions. So much so that a 2013 Supreme Court decision recognized that the government failed to distribute the land to the Métis people equitably. Education exclusion. Active in Canada from the 1890s to the 1990s, Canada's history is this. Residential schools were an intentional effort by the government to assimilate Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live at these schools. These children were punished for expressing one's Indigenous culture or language. Malnourishment, sexual and physical abuse, torture, lack of medical care, and neglect were common practice at these schools. It was Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1939, for the sole purpose to take the Indian out of the child. There were 130 residential schools, approximately 150,000 students sent to live at these schools. These were the only schools with graveyards and many with barbed wire fences. Communities were left without children. Social, family dynamics were destroyed and forever changed. Truth and reconciliation is a business imperative. It's important to acknowledge the past and ongoing trauma that Indigenous peoples are facing, and understanding what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is. Why was it created? What is it about? And what the 94 calls to actions are, with paying specific attention to call to action number 92, which we will now discuss. Call to action number 92 are your employer-specific guidelines. Recommendation number 92 asks the corporate sector and their leadership to adopt the United Nations declarations on the right of Indigenous peoples. The Commission calls for meaningful consultation, long-term sustainable opportunities from economic development projects, as well as education and training for managers on the history of the Indigenous peoples, intercultural competency, human rights, and anti-racism. They called upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, commonly known as UNDRIP, as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. What kind of educational opportunities could be provided through online learning, instructor-led courses and webinars? What are your collective knowledge gaps? How will your response help your company to improve your Indigenous inclusion workplace performance and your engagement with Indigenous communities, people, and businesses? How will you position your company's response to the CRC report to achieve positive media and community profile? Your key cultural capabilities to advance your business. Do you recognize Indigenous diversities? Differences between groups, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Despite the diversity of Indigenous peoples and communities, all Indigenous peoples in Canada share the experience of colonization in one form or another. You need to understand how they are different from your own, as well as having Indigenous people lead, guide, and prepare cultural competency training, and creating inclusion and safe environments for all employees. Your company's Indigenous strategies and messaging. Indigenous people want to feel that the company they work for or partner with values their community and the skills, perspectives, cultures, and values that they bring to the organization. They want to know that the company has in place a strategy that shows effective recruitment of Indigenous people, partnerships with Indigenous organizations, and investments in community and development. Indigenous employees want to know that the company brand is associated with a positive relationship with Indigenous communities and that the company's leadership supports these relationships. They want to see the company has put into place the right policies and value statements that reflect the desire to make these relationships work. The strength and coherence of the company's overarching strategy is one of the important considerations that Indigenous people make when considering whether to join or partner with a company for a job, a career, or projects. Keep in mind the strong kinships, family, and community connections that Indigenous people have. Frankly, they are unlikely to join or partner with a company as an employee or a partner if the company brand does not have a strong, positive resonance within their community. Or if they do not join, then their longevity with the company will probably have a short fuse. Some companies administer their corporate social responsibility and employee volunteer programs at the front line or at the site level, in addition to what is done through their headquarters. There may be lots of positive things happening originally that are not rolled up. The TRC says that a deliberate and purposeful response is important. It requires dialogue within your company. An assessment is needed about what you are currently doing to create a TRC calls to action strategy. Design and build community and business alliances and partnerships. Get to know the community and their socioeconomic priorities, which will ultimately increase your knowledge and understanding. Relationship building and providing Indigenous business opportunities. The TRC explains that reconciliation means establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. Reconciliation is a process of being together in a new and better way. It is about healing the past and creating a new, more honorable future. Reconciliation is not about guilt, shame, or blame. It is about acknowledging the destructive systems and harm of our collective past. It is also about understanding how those destructive systems operate today and then creating new systems, new ways of relating and understanding based on respect. Commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Ensure that the Indigenous peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and educational opportunities in the corporate sector, and that the Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Benefits to employers. Partnering with Indigenous peoples, organizations, groups, and businesses brings many benefits for the public and private sectors. Every organization can benefit in numerous ways, from hiring or partnering Indigenous employees. These benefits include, but are not limited to, investing in Canada's future and prosperity, thereby improving inclusiveness for Indigenous citizens in the workplace. Businesses and communities create more local employment, which means for more disposable income. Indigenous people who feel included and valued as an employee or a partner are more likely to promote the organization and similar career paths and opportunities to other Indigenous peoples and groups. The market increased through increased exposure to Indigenous clientele as a result of showing corporate social responsibility. Six strategies to engage for effective business engagements. There is a rise in successful partnerships between companies and Indigenous communities, often within the resource development companies at the helm. The success of these partnerships is first attributed to following the duty to consult. Indigenous groups were offered free and prior informed consent. This formed the foundation of the business relationship. When an Indigenous group has difficulties in responding to an opportunity or a request for an engagement, often the problem does not stem from a lack of competency or capability. Rather, the problem may be a lack of capacity, as personnel may be inundated with other requests. Something to consider within the Indigenous populations, band offices, Indigenous groups, that they wear many hats at the business level. To avoid this problem, early engagement is imperative. It can be challenging for a corporation to align its values with those of Indigenous partners. Doing so may require partners to reconsider how to apply core values, but a successful partnership is worth it. It will generate a return on investment to both the community and the company. Successful relationships require buy-in throughout the entire organization, from the owners to the board of directors, to senior leadership, to employees, to unions and on-site contractors. And sustained commitment. From 5 years to 50 years, long-term timeline requires a sustained commitment that goes beyond any single business leader and needs to be reflected throughout the organization. Two-way knowledge transfer. These exchanges help both parties understand the importance of perspectives and values, which ultimately support business success. Understanding cultural differences during engagements. Identification of some of the traditional colonial processes that hinder the engagement of Indigenous candidates and businesses can be facilitated by understanding cultural differences between Indigenous peoples and colonial society. Community is first for all values Indigenous communities. Work is often motivated by a group need because value is emphasized throughout community. Communications. Preferred over oral is preferred over print. Soft-spoken words carry the farthest, and nodding is not necessarily in an agreement. Group praise holds of higher value and ties back to the sense of community. And this slide talks about from Indigenous employees' perspectives. Indigenous candidates may resist speaking highly of themselves. Self-promotion is often frowned upon in their culture. Reluctance to interrupt meaning to state opinion for the same reasons. Reluctance or consider alternative job requirements, be open-minded, and establish an Indigenous career development program. By understanding this reality, a manager can tailor their dialogue in a way that the individual can express their accomplishments or point of view and recognize the relevant skills that can be acquired in unconventional ways. We have a rich oral culture and they learn from the land. And local communities and Indigenous youth programs are also a great resource for career development programs. Getting started. The Indigenous engagement and employment strategies. These are two products that we offer at Indigenous Works.
If any of you meet with me as National Director of Member Relations, either some of you I suspect are here to learn as part of your internal knowledge capital development at your organizations, but some of you might also be the lead for HR or D&I. And so these are the things that we ultimately have conversations about when we're trying to determine your organization's strategies, goals, and challenges as it relates to Indigenous inclusion. So our baseline assessment is quite a simple process, but a very robust one. And it requires about a half an hour of the kind of team lead at your organization to shift about 26 questions into your corporate kind of familiar language for your organization. But what it does is we then schedule a 2-hour facilitated meeting with members of your organization from leadership, communications, procurement, HR, and CSR. And everybody gets in the room. We have at least 5, but I think we facilitated up to 30. And the facilitator goes through this series of questions, and everyone can kind of give their thoughts on a Likert scale. So 5, very much agree to very much disagree. And it allows for an open floor conversation where somebody in HR might have a different sense of where your organization is as it relates to Indigenous inclusion than leadership does, because often leadership's um, kind of the hype person in the room and might feel as though all the things are being done, whereas HR might feel as though there needs to be some more robust retention strategies or recruitment strategies. And so when the 2-hour facilitated um, meeting is complete, we come back and write a report, and that is given to your organization. And what we've found is that report kind of assesses your strengths, weaknesses, and areas that can be worked on. And then that informs 80% of your engagement and Indigenous inclusion strategy moving forward. And it places your organization on what we call the inclusion continuum. That's what this next slide is. So we have organizations that come to us in many stages of their inclusion journey. It starts from indifference down at the bottom and works uh, towards full inclusion. So indifference is often an organization might come to us because they've had some bad press, or they know that they need to do something with Indigenous inclusion and they're leaning towards more of a tokenism type mindset. And then we kind of aim to have conversations that include all of these 9 facets. So leadership and governance, organizational culture, responsibility, accountability, employee engagement, positioning, social impact, investment in resources, relationships and trust, and value and validation. And so we aim to kind of move the dial on those 9 um, uh, key indicators. And as you move your organization through adopting these values and kind of thinking about them from the lens of how an Indigenous person coming to your organization might um, feel welcomed, and then also how your external communication strategy um, uh, adopts these and can understand them in the context of how you move in your community as it relates to Indigenous communities. And so as you kind of move the dial on the 9, you move up the inclusion continuum from indifference up through initiation and inclusion. And from our perspective, a fully inclusive workplace will have sound internal knowledge capital. So um, most staff inside your organization will have at least a baseline of knowledge about Indigenous history. We have an Indigenous History 101 course, and that kind of helps. And then also attending these thought leadership webinars. And so that's your internal knowledge capital, and that can create a better environment where any Indigenous employees that you bring in are more willing to stay. And so that informs your retention strategy. And then once that is in place and the foundations are good internally, then we would give guidance on how your recruitment strategy is working. So conversations that I've been having lately with organizations are about, what does your company offer for bereavement leave? Have you considered perhaps that 1-day bereavement leave might not be appealing to Indigenous people? So in the context of loss in Indigenous community, it's entirely normal and accepted that at least 6 days would be needed. So 1 day to travel back to community, 4 days to mourn in community, and 1 day to travel back. And so I would go so far as to say, if your policy is very strict on only 1 day, and it is a loss in community to that particular Indigenous employee, they would likely leave or quit if it meant they couldn't go and mourn appropriately with family and community. So that's a thing to consider. Also, beyond just the job description and kind of position offerings, what have your recruiters been trained along the lines of what Mandy brought up earlier in the presentation, where eye contact and interrupting and kind of the flow of conversation has subtle nuances in Indigenous culture. And so sometimes eye contact or lack thereof can be interpreted as lack of confidence, whereas it's a respect thing in Indigenous culture. And so, have your recruiters been given that kind of cultural competency awareness to not just exclude somebody from an, an employment process just based on those things alone? And so, and then a fully inclusive workplace would have internal strategy, recruitment strategy, and then your external communications. You'll know kind of what traditional and unceded or territory lands you're on. You might have already engaged with the communities or nations in your region or where your head of operations are. If you're in an urban setting, building partnerships and relationship with the local friendship centers or local economic development organizations, and how you can think about it beyond just a casual kind of exchange of emails, but what does meaningful partnership look like for your organization or business or government institution to build those meaningful relationships? And so that's where you would be a fully inclusive workplace. Internal is sound, recruitment is sound, and your external plan is sound, and you understand kind of your regional map and ecosystem. So there we go. This is the continuum again from 1 to 7. I always struggle with this particular version of the continuum because it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the moons go in a little bit different order for my brain. But so it goes from indifference, where tokenism or inclusion is not on the radar and it's mostly done for selfish reasons, through to image and initiation, and then the last stage being maximizing performance. And then here we go. This is another service that we offer, and which is new. We have, I think, 4 now employers of choice, but this is a certification in 7 steps. And it is facilitated by Mandy with the help of our Chief Operating Officer, Craig Hall. And so far, the feedback that we've received from organizations that have gone through this process with us is that it's very, very meaningful to them and helps tremendously to create a sound strategy for Indigenous inclusion. Often organizations come to us with very good intentions and the desire to be strong allies, but they might not have any Indigenous people on staff, or they are hopefully aware that they don't want to put the additional burden on Indigenous staff to do the kind of cultural competency training or advisement to the rest of the organization off the side of their desk. And so we have these offerings, the baseline assessment and this employer of choice program, which can create a strategy that then is trackable, and the reporting mechanisms inside are often very much appreciated by the HR and DEI kind of pillar inside of an organization, and it communicates it clearly back up to leadership, which is useful for all folks. So 10 promising practices. To understand the differences between Indigenous groups. So in the context of Canada, we can't think of these things in a pan-Indigenous way. We have the different distinctions, which is Inuit, First Nations, and Métis, but across that, we need to understand that each nation is its own people's group with its own history. So where I come from, I'm on the traditional and unceded territory of the Shisha Nation, which is on the south coast of BC, inside kind of the Salish region. My Indigenous ancestry is Wendat through my mother's side, but I'm born and raised here on Shisha territory. So to understand the context of that, kind of up the coast from me is the Sliammon territories, and slightly down more towards Vancouver is Squamish or Squamish territories. And so those are all individual peoples and nations with their own history and their own language. And even it can get more complex than that across the Georgia Strait for me, or Salish Sea. as I prefer to call it, is Nanaimo, Duncan, up to Camel River, and that's Hulkaminum territory. And so there is at least 50 different dialects inside that small region for how they might pronounce certain words. And so to come to the table with an idea that perhaps what you might have learned in Alberta or Saskatchewan um, could work across that province and then be translatable to this region. Um, we need to think of things in not a pan-Indigenous way and be very aware that there are differences between the Indigenous groups. Then the study of the 4 pillars, which were brought up in the previously in the presentation, to review the TRC report. As far as these reports go, TRC is probably the most actionable. I'm a bit of a policy nerd myself, and so the RCAP, or Royal Proclamation on Indigenous Peoples, or Aboriginal peoples then, which was developed and which Indigenous Works was kind of born out of, is enormous. And I believe there's over 400 recommendations, which is almost unachievable. They just kind of, nobody even reads that far. But the TRC report and its calls to action are very tangible and make a lot of sense and are broken down by kind of the industry or area that they focus on: health, education, business. And then call to action 92 as part of your framework. And then invest in your own cultural capabilities. So that's where I talked about having strong internal knowledge capital first. And then review and create the company Indigenous messaging and branding. That's where you create a strategy for long-term partnership and meaningful external communication. Create Indigenous business relationships, pardon me. So this is where some organizations and businesses which are looking for public tenders, construction companies, and kind of work with government. And the federal government has come up with you need to be able to demonstrate 5% Indigenous spend. And so how are you going to build meaningful partnerships and relationships with these Indigenous businesses? Two-way knowledge transfer. So this is where relationship building again is key, and we need to understand that it can't just be a one-off email with kind of demanded deliverables. There's a fundamental necessity for building relationship. Adapt an enterprise-wide approach. So this is where I was explaining inside the baseline, where when we do that foundational meeting, the 2-hour meeting, we have learned that having representation from leadership, comms, procurement, HR, and CSR is so valuable, because then you get the enterprise-wide approach, and leadership might have some more sensitivity to what HR might be going through. And then to communicate and celebrate successes. And this is reconciliation in action. So many organizations are a bit shy to market or promote the successes they're having or relationships and partnerships that they're building. But this comes from a mindset of deficits-based reporting and not wanting to kind of tokenize, which I understand, and there has to be a definite sensitivity to how these things are communicated. But you really want people to know that your organization and your staff and what you're doing is in the spirit of reconciliation, because then we know that we're making progress rather than this constant barrage of bad news. And it is valuable to Indigenous people and invaluable to the rest of Canada as well. And then this is the last slide. So thank you, Mingwich. And Mandy's email address is there, but I've also placed mine in the chat, and I will open up to chat as well. If you feel or prefer to just type in the chat, you're welcome to, or you're also welcome to, hold on, to stop sharing. Share to, nope, I don't want, sorry guys, this is not my area of expertise, but I will bring up the chat here. Okay.
You
There we
mind if I
go.
ask a question?
Absolutely. Please do.
Awesome. So I apologize. I came in about 10 minutes late because I was in a different meeting before this
No
that ran a little bit
problem.
later. Can we have recordings to this presentation?
Absolutely. So we do send out the slide deck, any links to any information that kind of gets asked in the chat over our conversation here, and also a video of it.
Okay, awesome. That would be great because you said a lot of good things that are not necessarily in the slide itself. So your recording will be awesome to get all the information.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And so thank you. Give me a second here to go up in the chat. So we have quite a lot of people in the neighboring region, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. Welcome. Very happy to have you. We have Treaty 6 here. Let's see. On a pause, a question. Okay, so Masha Ali asked about land acknowledgement, and Monica and pardon me, I will not be able to pronounce your name properly. You Kun perhaps provided 2 links, so whose land and native land, and Indigenous Works can also provide some guidance. We do offer land acknowledgement, kind of a review of what your existing one might be, and we can develop one from scratch on various levels. So a very basic one, kind of an intermediate and an advanced. And Mandy also takes care of that.
Yeah,
So
Nicole, just
there we go.
to register a comment on that
Ooh.
is with those 2 websites, don't forget that one of them was actually developed out of the US. So some of the information tends to be incorrect with whose land or native land.
Perfect. Okay. Who can we reach out to arrange this assessment? So that's Patricia. Patricia, I'm putting my email in the chat again, and it's me. So, and any questions that anybody might have, big, small, or otherwise, please feel free to send me an email. My position is relatively new to the organization. I've been with Indigenous Works since May, and it was the position of National Director was entirely developed to be of service to our leadership circle members and any organizations that come with questions. And then I we sit down and have a half an hour conversation, less if necessary. And then I get to direct you to the talent, which is vast and inside of Indigenous Works. We're a small team, but the talent is amazing here. And then I get to kind of help figure out a strategy and next steps that work best for your organization. So loss in community. Cheryl Doolin asks, loss in community. So this may not be considered immediate family, which is defined in our bereavement policy. How do we accommodate this in a fair way to all we employ? You want to give it a chance at that, Mandy? I hope you're still there. I can't see your face again.
Sorry,
Okay.
Indigenous policies.
We're talking so in the context of your 10 steps, I brought up the fact that it's useful for organizations to, when considering the job posting and the offerings of positions, that bereavement leave for Indigenous people can be a make or break. And so if there's a loss in community, there can be a very strong need to return and mourn appropriately. And so this is what Cheryl is speaking
Yeah,
to.
because from an Indigenous perspective, it's community. Even with cousins, aunts, uncles. Many of us were raised by our grandparents. Our cousins are more like our brothers and sisters. So I mean, it is a tricky thing to do, but we do have organizations that have taken that into consideration, that we don't necessarily have the traditional roles within the family. When there's a passing in the community, the entire community shuts down, the entire community mourns that person. So we've had organizations kind of put that into policy.
Okay, if you have a follow-up on that, you're welcome to put it in the chat, Cheryl, or feel free to send me an email. So Jocelyn asks, do we share the slides? Yes, we do. Alana asks, is there a public list of certified employers of choice? Not yet, but only because we are at the tail end of finishing a full website upgrade, which I am very happy about, and which will also include a members portal. So there'll be a vast repository of information that leadership circle members and their staff will be able to access for additional information. And it's also a cleanup. I don't know if you've visited our website. There is a lot of information there, and sometimes the path between one thing and the other can be a bit difficult. So we are doing a full revamp, and there we go. Okay. Again, next question. Coyote, please forgive me for perhaps pronouncing your name wrong. Hello, Nicole. If we want to be allies in our respective organizations, how will we go about educating colleagues and starting real conversations? Do you have a framework or approach to go about this? Go ahead, Mandy.
Yeah, that would be our baseline. Our baseline assessments would help with that, because in that we have that what we call the enterprise-wide approach. So there's buy-in from all levels, and then all levels of understanding within the organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, at least from an IW perspective for framework, that's the approach that we would take.
Mm-hmm. And then the educating of colleagues, just if your organization is really kind of starting on this journey, just a basic Indigenous 101, which we offer, and starting real conversations, because these can be complicated things to have, and sometimes organizations kind of tag the Indigenous person in the room and invite them into these real conversations, and it can be an uncomfortable tokenistic experience, and most Indigenous people would say, well, I can't speak for all Indigenous people. And so we need to be very sensitive and appropriate on what the strategy is to do that. And then Rochelle says, I'm curious if you're aware of African ancestral acknowledgements and how they can be used respectfully in addition to land acknowledgement. That is a blank for me. Do you have anything, Mandy?
That is unfortunately out of my purview and expertise.
Okay, so we're at 10:50 Pacific. We have 10 more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, it can be anything related to the presentation today or things that are kind of coming up in your work. Feel free to put it in the chat. You can unmute. Mandy and I will stick around for the additional 10 minutes. And if nobody has anything else, you're welcome to go or stick around. Thanks, Jocelyn and Carrie. Again, feel free to send me an email if anybody has any questions at all.
Hi, Nicole. I think my initial question was just a curious one of what can one person do to help?
So I would, I'll pass it to Mandy, and then I'll add anything else that has come from my learning over the past 5 months.
Yeah, it's, I would say is start the conversations. One of the things that we've come to realize, studies that Indigenous Works has done in the past, is that many organizations want to start the process of partnering, start the process of reconciliation and inclusion, but they just don't know how or where to get started. Oftentimes it's a matter of internal capacity. a lot of the organizations, are on a volunteer basis for internal committees, but, just registering your voice that you're willing to, be a part of this process and start would be the first step.
There's also a tremendous amount of open learning available for individuals. There's great books available. We have a tip sheet on our website that was part of our TRC offering, so Truth and Reconciliation. And it included a list of media as well as books you can read. And so that's a great way to kind of get access. And the lovely thing that I found in my own journey of learning more about my Indigenous ancestry and just indigeneity across Canada is there's room for small publications. Like that's one thing I find beautiful about Canada is we have some funding for creative works that might get a very small circulation, but there's still books available about it. And for that reason, you can have kind of a niche history or interest or cultural experience, and there can be a book about it. Lots of academic institutions are increasing their capacity of their Indigenous departments and offering lots of writing. And so get some books, watch some documentaries. Yeah.
I did have a question that kind of came at a talking point. So I'm calling in from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq out in Atlantic Canada. And in your presentation, you did mention, we can't necessarily look at Indigenous communities as one big community. There's lots of differences between communities. So I was wondering if your organization maybe partnered with other organizations that you might recommend across Canada that we can reach out to, so we can also get kind of a more regional take, or if there's any resources that your organization might have there.
So we have done regional ecosystem mapping for specific organizations if they come to us wanting to kind of get more information that way. It involves an exploratory call and a scoping, generally with Craig Hall, our COO. And so it's kind of like based on the individual needs of the organization or company or institution that's coming to us. And then we go out and find appropriate kind of sources and partnerships to develop.
Craig is also based out of Mi'kma'ki territory as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's unplanned, but much of the Indigenous Works team kind of covers all of the regions within Canada.
We need somebody from the north, though. This is
yes.
my goal. We need someone from Inuit territory. That would be lovely.
But the vast landscape of Canada has mostly been covered internally within the IW team.
So Holly, if you're interested specifically, feel free to send me an email and I can pick Craig's brains for some surface level stuff. But if you're wanting to do kind of like a real exploratory call, we can book that as well. So Nicole H at Indigenous Works.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah. So Carrie says the U of Alberta, countering Indigenous stereotypes is an Indigenous-led course, very informative and admittedly often challenging for settlers. Highly recommended. Thank you for that. Sharon says she's coming from Semiahmoo. Cool. Rochelle, thanks and thank you for joining in. And then Ashley saying Indigenous Canada through U of A is a valuable course, free to take, but if you want the certificate, you pay a small fee. We have 3 more minutes. Any last questions in there? Thank you again, everybody, for joining.
Watch everyone.